New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Green is recognized for 1 minute.
And still I rise, Mr. Speaker. I rise to announce that I will vote for this legislation, and I will do so because I know that there are 19 babies who were murdered at Robb Elementary School in Texas who will never have the right to vote. I rise to vote for it because there are 2 teachers who were murdered who will never have the opportunity to seek the future that was theirs. I rise because we have a governor in the state of Texas who could have saved all of those lives if he had but only, after the shooting at Walmart that took 23 lives, passed legislation such as what we're passing today. I rise because I don't want the blood of the next person murdered with an AR-15 type weapon on my hands. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
We will continue to reserve, Mr.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Gentleman from New York.
And would move forward with a question before I yield time to myself as I'm next in line to speak. Friends, at the September 21st hearing, I presented the CEOs of the largest U.S. banks with information on their connections to slavery. I asked if they'd done enough to atone for their connectivity to slavery, to which all indicated they had. However, thereafter, I followed up and asked them if they had and would commit to preparing an atonement plan. And I asked if they would raise their hands if they were prepared to submit an atonement plan. These are the persons present, and none, not one, raised a hand. I mention this because, you may move it away. I mention this because I think the point that has been made today by several members, including Mr. Garcia, Ms. Beatty, who is not here, Ms. Garcia, who's here, Mr. Garcia, Ms. Garcia, and members of the panel, including Dr. Darity, the notion that we will be able to resolve this by simply having these very wealthy businesses simply cooperate, which is what I would like to see, doesn't seem to be manifesting itself. I just don't see that happening in the current circumstance that we're dealing with. So given that it doesn't, I have a bill that I filed as a placeholder, and this bill would simply give us the opportunity to amend it and later on file an additional bill that would allow us to move forward with the kind of bill that you've been discussing and calling to my attention. It would be H.R. 9337 that's been filed, and it requires the Securities and Exchange Act to allow us to have racial audits, racial equity audits. I think that this is a genesis, but I think there's much more that we need to do. So what I'd like to do is ask Dr. Darity about your desire and belief that we can have these endowments funded by these institutions. I've had the honor of working with you, Dr. Darity, and I believe you've presented a plan, a sort of outline as to how this can be accomplished. So would you take just a moment, please, and explain how you would have this take place as it relates to the financial institutions?
I think I'd like to talk about a specific example, which is the case of J.P. Morgan Chase that had 2 subsidiaries that were based in the state of Louisiana. And I performed an exercise of examining the historically Black colleges and universities in the state of Louisiana and matched them with peer institutions. So, for example, I matched Dillard University with Tulane University. I matched Southern University with Louisiana State University and looked at the per-student differentials in endowments
Dr. Darity,
across
I'm going
those
to
institutions.
ask that you suspend for just a moment because the time for Ms. Williams has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes and would ask that you continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I came up with a calculation of the amount that would be required to bring the endowments of the historically Black colleges and universities in Louisiana on par with their peer historically white institutions. And if I recall correctly, the total amount was not particularly staggering relative to JP Morgan Chase's assets, which are now, I believe, in excess of $3 trillion. It's interesting that it was mentioned earlier that they had set aside a fund for $5 million. I think that that's a very, very small allotment given the scale of their resources.
Thank you. Let me move to another area of great concern for me, and the chairwoman mentioned this in her questioning, and that is, why have we not moved along to a greater extent in trying to get this reparations and atonement, I separate the two, get this done? I find that many people are ashamed of being associated with the title slave. I consider myself a proud ancestor, proud to be associated with my ancestors who are slaves. I think that that's a part of my heritage. They built the country to a certain extent. They are the foundational mothers and fathers of this country. The Capitol building, at Yale, at Harvard University, they've constructed facilities there. And I'm very proud to be a descendant of the people who built the country, but many are not. So I'm asking now, how is it that you think we can get beyond this being the perfect victims, the persons who are victims yet ashamed to acknowledge that we are associated with an institution that we did not create, but that has caused us great harm over the centuries, not over the years, but over the centuries? Who would like to give me some assistance? Yes, if you'll announce your name and speak, please.
Thank you. It's Dania Francis. I think an important aspect is education. Right, we are afraid of teaching the history of this country in a way that erases all of these things that we don't want to see. Right, at the university.
Let me interrupt for just a moment, because you've gone exactly where I'd like for you to go. Now, in Texas, we're making it almost impossible to teach this type of history because it's being labeled as something that is antithetical to the best interests of children. Are you familiar with what I speak of? Okay, you may continue, please. How do we address it?
Absolutely. And so I think it's a local problem that becomes national, and we need to have solutions that address it locally as well. Right. So we need to be in those school board meetings. We need to mobilize and try to take back, right, some of the control over the curriculum in spaces that are trying to deny what is the documented history of the country. And so I think it's a local problem that we have to address. There has to be a grassroots effort in order to avoid the larger national problem that it's becoming.
Thank you. Finally, I'd like to ask each of you, if you would, to give me a yes or no answer to this question. This committee has jurisdiction over financial institutions. Do you believe that we should develop legislation that would have an impact on financial institutions should they fail to engage in atonement? And I'll leave it at impact as opposed to the type of impact. We'll just say impact for now. So let's start with Dr. Darity Jr. Your thoughts, yes or no, should we?
Yes.
Dr. Francis,
Yes.
Dr. Roberts,
Yes.
Ms. Seth Rockman,
Yes.
Mr. And finally, Ms. Sarah Fetterman.
Yes.
All persons having agreed, I think that you've given us reason to move forward with legislation, and I will encourage my friends who have addressed this issue today to help me with the legislation. Both Mr. and Ms. Garcia, Ms. Beatty has already been involved with this, and let's see if we can come up with legislation that will, Ms. Williams as well, that will help us to encourage our financial institutions to atone for their connections to slavery that have benefited them over the years. I thank all of you for appearing today.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the great Maya Angelou summarized the essence of my very existence when she proclaimed, "Bringing the gifts my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave." I proudly say that I am a descendant of enslaved people. Slavery existed in this country for some 246 years. The value of 246 years of unpaid slave labor has been estimated to be as much as $14.2 trillion. Let's examine for just a moment each mega bank's involvement in financing slavery. Truist Financial Corporation has assets of approximately $532 billion. 5 predecessor institutions engaged in financing slavery. PNC, Financial Services Corporation, assets of approximately $534 billion. A predecessor loaned $135,000 to a railroad company that used slave labor in 1852. U.S. Bank Corp, assets of approximately $582 billion. A predecessor institution made a loan secured by enslaved people. Wells Fargo, assets of approximately $1.71 trillion. Predecessor bank accepted enslaved people as collateral in at least 24 transactions, took temporary possession of enslaved people from defaults on loans. Conducted business with the Confederacy. Citicorp, assets of approximately $1.72 trillion. Provided a chart of mergers pursuant to a request that we made, and acquisitions over a course of 210 years that is lengthy and complex, but didn't give us a detailed report. Staff has asked for more information, hasn't received it to this date. More to be said on that at a later time. Bank of America, assets of approximately $244 trillion. A predecessor bank secured a mortgage with real and personal property. The borrower's property included 13 enslaved people. A predecessor bank agreed to a $10,000 mortgage to U.S. Secretary of State John Forsyth with 40 enslaved people as collateral. J.P. Morgan Chase, assets of approximately $3.38 trillion. Predecessor banks accepted 13,000 enslaved people as collateral for loans. Came into possession of 1,250 enslaved people from defaults on loans. In the case of J.P. Morgan Chase, there has been an apology publicly made and an announcement of $5 million scholarship which amounts to about $384.61 per enslaved person. These scholarships went to persons in Louisiana. I have a question for you, each of you. Question is this: if you believe your bank has done enough to atone for your involvement with slavery, kindly raise a hand into the air. Let the record reflect that no hand has been raised. Next question: will you publicly publish an atonement plan or on or before your next appearance before the committee? An atonement plan. You've indicated that you've not done enough. Will you publish an atonement plan on or before your next visit? If so, raise your hand. Let the record reflect that not one bank has proposed an atonement plan. Let's move to another area quickly. I don't perceive either of you to be, any of you to be a person of color. Have you self-identified as a person of color? Raise your hand. Not one person raises a hand. In the next 10 years, will there be a person of color to head your institution? If so, raise your hand. Let Truist Bank, and that is the only one, I think. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the Secretary for appearing today. I'm also very much in sympathy with the families of these Border Patrol agents who lost their lives. Always saddened to hear about lives lost. All life is precious. Mr. Secretary, would you just take my 2 minutes, if you would, of what's left, about a minute, 40 seconds, and explain why a wall will not solve the problem at the border, please?
Congressman, we have observed individuals bypassing the wall, intruding beyond it, cutting it, climbing over it, and the like. The border requires a layered solution to its security. The greatest force multiplier there is technology, and that is why we, in our fiscal year 2023 budget, are requesting that Congress allow us to invest further in technology. We're also seeking to resource our Border Patrol agents. We make, for the first time since 2011, a request to increase our Border Patrol forces by 300 personnel, not to mention additional case processors and the like, so that we can get our Border Patrol agents out into the field. The fact of the matter is that the border is not the right solution. The wall is not the right solution for the border. We have to harness innovation and technology as the most economic, efficient means as a force multiplier to our extraordinary personnel.
Well, I thank you for your service, and I wish I had more time to allow you to respond to some of the things that have infringed upon your character.
Gentleman's time from Texas has expired.
I will yield to Mr. Green, the gentleman from Texas, for your 5 minutes. Mr. Green, I think you're still on mute. We still can't hear you, Mr. Green. Okay, there he goes.
Thank you. I'm audible. Thank you, Madam Chair. And to the law enforcement officer who is there, I would have you know I have great respect for law enforcement.
Thank you.
My uncle was a deputy sheriff, and I believe that I'm in Congress probably because of him. He told me when I was a very young child that I was going to be a lawyer. And because he was so well respected, from that moment forward, I wanted to be a lawyer. I never had any thought of being anything else. By the way, I didn't know what a lawyer was at the time. But my uncle said it, and it meant something. So I have great respect.
Thank you.
This problem at the border is something that we've been grappling with for some time. It seems to me that any solution is going to require doing something about the conditions that would cause a mother, knowing what can happen to her child along this route, cause that mother to say, I'm going to risk sending my child north because the conditions here are such that I don't believe my child is safe. So it seems to me that we have to focus on doing something about those conditions. I believe that the law enforcement officers, I don't doubt you when you say you're overwhelmed. But what you're doing is at the border, and we have to do something beyond the border. We now have sent billions to Ukraine, and I voted to do it, and I'll send more. I want to send planes. I want to do whatever we can do to help them. It seems to me that we can do something more for our neighbors. And I think it's going to take the will of Congress to get it done. But that has to be a part of the solution. Now, I've had a personal experience with this. I had a constituent, Mr. Escobar, who was deported. He was married to an American woman. He had 2 children born in the United States of America, no criminal history, and he was deported. I went to El Salvador 3 times. I brought him home on the 3rd time. 3 times. He could not walk the streets. When he was deported, he became sort of a target, if you will. So we brought him home. He was within the law, nothing outside of the law. But it's really sad to know the conditions that persons are living under, such that they would send their children over this long distance. And the staff has provided me some intelligence that I'd just like to share with everyone. I'm sure that everyone has perused the documentation that we have. It reads, families and other asylum seekers expelled back to Mexico are often targeted by drug cartels and face violence and extortion. In fact, human rights organizations have documented nearly 10,000 instances of people being kidnapped, tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered after being expelled under Title 42. Title 42 is the law of the land. I'm not debating whether that should not happen under the law of the land, just stating the facts. Conditions in Mexico have led to hundreds of parents fearing for the lives of their children to choose to self-separate, send their children across the border alone, knowing that unaccompanied children would be accepted and cared for by the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a tragedy. So, Sheriff, I'm appealing to you. I just want to know, do you know enough about it? If you don't, I'll understand. To give a comment about the conditions that are causing a mother to send her baby on this dangerous journey, knowing what the consequences might be, but she'd rather face that than have her child stay with her and suffer. Your thoughts, Sheriff, please.
Member Green, I appreciate those comments. And one of my objectives as a sheriff and with my sheriff association is humanitarian. We have big hearts here as we wear the badge, and we respect. I've talked to my sheriffs in Del Rio, Sheriff Martinez, Sheriff Wilmot over in Yuma, Arizona. They see what you're talking about. That's what those examples. In my section of the southeast corner of the state of Arizona, we don't see that. We see 100% aggravated individuals that are camouflaged, that are coming to the country for all ill intent. They're taking advantage of current times. That's what bothers me. That's why I'm testifying today on the public safety side of this and the humanitarian side. We also see the death. We also see those that die in the process of coming across our border because we've lost the management side of it on the public safety side. And that's where I come from. There's got to be a balance. Member Green, I agree with you. There's got to be a balance. We need to take the politics out of this. We need to take the re-election thoughts out of it. Let's get to the business and secure our country, secure our border, and make this humanitarian and public safety and national security.
Thank you, Madam
Sheriff,
Chair.
thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I will now yield to the gentleman from
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, and still I rise, a proud, liberated Democrat, unbought, unbossed, and unafraid to speak truth to power as well as truth about power concerning the topic of slavery and the need for atonement. Let's begin. Let's start with slavery and identify it for what it was. A proper identification of slavery would cause one to conclude that it was truly one of the greatest crimes ever committed against humanity. Slavery was kidnapping. People were stolen from their homes. They were traversed across the oceans. Slavery was murder, because in the process of transferring persons, if they became unruly, unmanageable, they could simply be thrown overboard into the shark-infested waters. In fact, it is said that sharks would follow the ships, knowing that at some point a body might be thrown over that they could feed upon. Slavery was robbery. People had their identities stolen from them. People were put in a position such that they could not know who they were in terms of their connection to the past, and they could not get an education about what the world was all about. Slavery was rape. It was not unusual for the masters to rape the women. It was not unusual for them to father the children, and then for those children to become slaves. Slavery was about the enslavement of babies. What kind of people would do such a dastardly thing as to enslave babies? The people who would do this were the people who didn't see the human beings, the human qualities associated with slavery. They just saw them as chattel, something to be traded, something to be used, and something to be discarded. Slavery was also about forced labor. And I'd like to say more about this topic of forced labor and slavery, because I happen to have the good fortune to be the chair of Oversight and Investigations on the Financial Services Committee, the chair of the subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. And I serve under the leadership of the Honorable Maxine Waters, who is one of the most courageous members of Congress. Under her leadership, we've had hearings on this question of slavery and how this slavery, this evil, has impacted not only the people of that time when they were enslaved, but also the people of this time. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Speaker should suspense. House should be in order. Member may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a very sensitive topic, Mr. Speaker, and it deserves our attention. And for those who desire not to give it attention, there are places for them to have their conversations off the floor. I beg that they would do so. Very sensitive topic. We have held hearings on this topic. And at these hearings, we have discovered that there are institutions that have a historical connection to slavery. These institutions include our mega banks. I'll call them big banks. They include mega insurance companies. I'll call them big insurance companies. These mega banks, these big insurance companies have predecessor institutions, predecessor banks and insurance companies that actually engaged in the slave trade by way of, with banks, insuring slaves as chattel, and the insurance companies would insure them, and the banks would make loans against slaves as chattels. Let me give some examples. One big bank had a predecessor bank that was found to have had a connection to chattel slavery by accepting 8,149 enslaved people as collateral for loans and coming into possession of 437 enslaved people. Another predecessor bank accepted approximately 13,000 enslaved people, 13,000, as collateral for loans, as well as took possession of approximately 1,250 enslaved people upon default. Mr. Speaker, it might be worthy of noting that these predecessor banks were located in our state. I was born in Louisiana. You represent a great congressional district in Louisiana. Predecessor banks that took possession of approximately 1,250 enslaved people upon defaults on loans. Another predecessor bank made a loan of $135,000 to a railroad company to use slave labor. Adjusted for inflation, $135,000 is worth approximately $4,776,840 in 2022. Another predecessor bank accepted enslaved people as collateral in at least 24 transactions, took possession of enslaved people upon default on loans, and engaged in business and investments with a confederacy that by 1862 exceeded $1.5 million. That amount is worth $44,230,000 in 2022. Mr. Speaker, I cannot in good conscience, as a proud descendant of enslaved people, I cannot in good conscience allow these transgressions to go unchallenged, to allow them to continue without atonement. There are some things that we ought not allow to remain a part of our history without proper redress. The enslavement of people and the profits that were made off of these people as slaves is something that must be redressed. These big banks and these big insurance companies have a duty, responsibility, and an obligation to atone for their connectivity to slavery. As a result, Mr. Speaker, I plan to file a big banks and big insurance companies atonement legislation, a piece of legislation that will address the injustices that were perpetrated upon human beings, the greatest crime against humanity that we call slavery. And this piece of legislation will require these big banks to assess whether their institutions, their predecessor institutions, had direct or indirect ties to or profited from the institution of slavery. We already know that some did. And they will have to issue a report containing all findings and determinations made in carrying out the assessments required, and to the extent the institutions, these big banks and these big insurance companies, identify ties to or profits from the institution of slavery, a disclosure of the steps these institutions have taken to reconcile such profits and ties shall be reported. And this report will be made available to the public, including on a website of each of the institutions making the reports. Further, this legislation will require a fine to be imposed on any institution that fails to issue a report as required, or that reports false, misleading, or inaccurate information on such a report. They shall be fined $20,000 per day until the report is issued properly, or until the report is corrected to not be false, misleading, or inaccurate. Mr. Speaker, this is a part of the process necessary for a great nation, and ours is a great nation, to be an even greater nation after it has properly reconciled for its greatest sin, its seminal sin of slavery. As I have indicated, one of the greatest crimes ever committed against humanity. A crime that has implications on this very day and will have implications on tomorrow in a very negative way. We still have people who are suffering from these crimes that were committed centuries ago. Slavery didn't end all of the suffering. After slavery, we had black codes, which allowed black people to be arrested and then forced to work as persons who were leased. It was called convict leasing. You could be arrested for something as simple as not having a job and then forced to work. Many people worked until they died. Literally, they would work them to death. In Texas, we have discovered a grave of 95 such people, known as the Sugar Land 95, a common grave with persons who were slave laborers. It didn't end there. Went on to have persons who were discriminated against lawfully in this country because we had segregation. Segregation was another means of maintaining people of African ancestry as second-class citizens, people who were not entitled to the same privileges and opportunities as others. But it didn't end there. We then suffered from, and still to this day, suffer from invidious discrimination. Yes, there are some people who say that it doesn't exist, but it does. There is invidious discrimination in the House of Representatives. Invidious discrimination, discrimination that keeps people from reaching their potential because of who they happen to be. In fact, our failure to recognize marriage, as we have voted to do so today, was a form of invidious discrimination. So it doesn't just consume people of African ancestry. I'm making that the topic today. On some future occasion, I will be talking about the invidious discrimination perpetrated against others. But today, as it relates to African Americans, there is still invidious discrimination in our country. But African Americans were not given the same opportunities to acquire wealth. Over the centuries, we've had circumstances where in this country, you could acquire wealth by simply going out in the West and fencing in as much property as you could, buy a Winchester rifle, defend it, and it was yours. You could simply squat and acquire land. People of African ancestry were not given the opportunity to acquire land in this fashion. When the GI Bill was passed, many people benefited from it. Very few of them were of African ancestry. People who fought, many of them died, but people who fought and survived and came back and could not get the same loans the same grants, the same opportunities as others. So the opportunity to build wealth has been denied. And that opportunity denied has manifested in a wealth gap that is unimaginable, with black people having pennies on the dollar for the many dollars that white people have in terms of wealth. This wealth gap is something that cannot be ignored, and atonement has to be a methodology by which we achieve a bringing together, closeness of this wealth gap, closing of the wealth gap, if you will. And until we close the wealth gap, we have to continue to require atonement. Now, there are many people who conclude that atonement and just talking about slavery is something that ought to be against the law. In the state of Texas, they have, in our legislature, imposed a law that, as many read it, would not allow teaching the truth about slavery in schools. There are people who don't want their children to be harmed by hearing about the suffering that people in this country had perpetrated and perpetuated upon them for centuries. They don't want their children to know. They want their children to believe that liberty and justice for all has always applied to all of the people in the country, and it hasn't. They want their children to believe that there's always been equal access to opportunity in this country, which is not true. They don't want their children taught the truth, but the truth is going to be told and taught. The truth will be known. Carlyle was right. No lie can live forever. William Cullen Bryant was right. Truth crushed to earth shall rise again. Dr. King was right. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The truth will be told. You can't hide it from your children. They need to know the truth. It's only after the truth is known that we can then reconcile and have an even greater country than we have today. The process of reconciliation requires atonement. And for this process of reconciliation, I have legislation pending to have a Department of Reconciliation, a department with a Secretary of Reconciliation, with undersecretaries of reconciliation, who will have the responsibility to wake up each and every day and deal with the racial wealth gap, deal with the invidious discrimination that took place against persons who came here and built the railroads, persons of Asian ancestry, the invidious discrimination that took place with the Trail of Tears, when people were forced to leave their homes, move across the country, and dwell in a foreign place as it related to them. Invidious discrimination to deal with the Latino population that many years ago had land taken from them. Yes, we need a Department of Reconciliation. I have the legislation for such a department. But notwithstanding that, we still need this legislation to deal with the atonement of these big financial institutions that have profited from the labor of human beings who were treated as chattels. Mr. Speaker, it is with great pride that I say every word that I have said today, because I am the proud descendant of these humble hands that helped build this Capitol. The proud descendant of these humble hands that helped build the roads and bridges, laid the foundation for this country. They were the foundational mothers and fathers of this country. And I'm proud to be a descendant of the enslaved people who helped make America great. And I'm proud to say that I think these enslaved people who helped make America great deserve more than being reviled, while the people who tried to maintain slavery are revered. The Confederacy, revered by this House of Representatives. Slavery reviled, the slaves reviled. Why do I say that the Confederacy was revered? or is revered or has been revered by this House? Because this House of Representatives granted a Congressional Gold Medal to Confederate soldiers. Some things bear repeating. The House of Representatives in this chamber passed legislation to accord a Congressional Gold Medal to Confederate soldiers. We revere the enslavers and revile the enslaved. That has to change. This Congress, or the next, should accord a Congressional Gold Medal to the enslaved people who built this country. If we can do it for the enslavers, we can do it for the enslaved. I will have legislation before this House to allow each and every person to go on record as to whether you have the courage, the intestinal fortitude necessary to set the record straight, to do the right thing. No, more importantly, to do the righteous thing. Give the people who built this country the same recognition that you gave to the people who would keep them in chains. You'll have your opportunity, dear brothers and sisters. We'll find out whether you put principle above politics, whether you're going to put the Confederacy above the enslaved. We'll find out, and I assure you, the record will be made known. We will know who voted for and who voted against. As you can see, Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order, but some things happen at certain times for reasons. We shall continue after the House is in order.
The House will be in order. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, we will file this legislation. We will give members an opportunity to demonstrate where they stand. Dr. King was right. The truest measure of the person is not where you stand in times of comfort and convenience. When all is well in your world, the truest measure of the person is where do you stand in times of great challenge and controversy. I plan to bring the time of challenge to the floor of the House. The question is, where will the members of this great House stand? Will members have the courage to accord a Congressional Gold Medal to the enslaved persons? Will members have the courage to pass a resolution asking for a Department of Reconciliation? Will members have the courage to vote for legislation to require these mega banks and mega insurance companies to atone for their connectivity to the greatest crime committed against humanity? We'll find out because the legislation will be presented. And Mr. Speaker, let me close with this. Notwithstanding all that I have said, I still love my country. I still pledge allegiance to the flag. I still sing the national anthem. And I still support those who choose not to say the Pledge of Allegiance and refuse to sing the national anthem. But I do it because I believe in the Constitution. I believe in the words liberty and justice for all, as extolled in the Pledge of Allegiance. I believe that we can be a country of the people, by the people, and for all of the people. And I believe these things in spite of the fact that my country hasn't always loved me as much as I loved it. Just celebrated my 25th birthday for the third time. And my country hasn't always loved me as much as I love my country. My country required me to drink from colored water fountains, Mr. Speaker. My country required me to sit in the back of the bus, to sit in the balcony of movies. My country required me to go to back doors and get my food. My country required me to step off the sidewalk when other persons of a different hue passed. I still love my country. I'm standing here today because I love my country and I want my country to live up to the promise made in the Declaration of Independence, the promise made in the Constitution. I want America to be America for all Americans. And until that day, I will still love my country, but I will remain a liberated Democrat, unbought, unbossed, and unafraid to speak truth to power and truth about power. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Under Speakers are now
for sharing your stories from Florida. At this time, it is a pleasure to yield to my friend from the great state of Texas, Representative Al Green, for as much time as he may consume.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding the time. And Madam Speaker, and still I rise. And I rise tonight to take a stand on behalf of the pro-choice movement and women who have had to make the choice. Women who've had to make this tough decision, this choice. And let's get the record straight. Henceforth and forevermore, let it be known that you're either pro-choice or you're anti-choice. Pro-choice or anti-choice. It's easy to be anti-choice when you don't have to make the choice. It's easy to be anti-choice when it's not your wife that was raped. It's easy to be anti-choice when it's not your daughter that has had the incestuous relationship without her permission, I always say, but even with her permission, it's wrong. It's wrong. It's easy to make the choice when it's not your child or your wife. You can be anti-choice then. But I only wonder how many persons who have been anti-choice, when confronted with having to make this choice, became pro-choice. We'll never know. You can be anti-choice before the public and then pro-choice when it serves your purpose. I sincerely believe, Madam Speaker and Ms. Fletcher, that the long arm of the law has no place in a woman's womb. This is not where the law belongs. This is the property of a woman, and she should make these decisions herself with those that she has trust in, those who care for her, those that she believes will help her to come to the right conclusions. I stand for those who are pro-choice, and for those who are anti-choice, I say, thank God you've not had to make the choice. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, we're witnessing now why we have the invidious discrimination that exists in this country. Not one word has been said about the invidious discrimination, the high costs and loans that people of color suffer. Not one word is being said about it. Rather, there's always an effort to deflect. And this has been going on for centuries. but not today. It ends today. I now yield to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me first thank Chairman Green for yielding and for his outstanding job of managing the floor today. I would like to also thank Chairwoman Maxine Waters for her leadership in bringing diversity and inclusion to the forefront of the conversation in the financial services industry. It was her vision to create the Financial Services Committee's subcommittee on diversity and inclusion, and I have had the honor to serve as its chair since its inception. The racial justice equity package before us today is very much the product of the subcommittee's work over the past 3+ years, and I am proud to say that many of its provisions were authored by subcommittee members. Republicans participated in the hearing, and today when we deflect to issues like what we're hearing, it's very alarming. There is nothing controversial in this package or the bills I am going to reference. 2 of my bills are included in this package: the Diversity and Inclusion Data Accountability and Transparency Act, or referred to as D&I Data Act, that will direct the offices of minority and women inclusion to collect data on the financial institutions they oversee. This will allow us to measure the progress that banks and other financial institutions are making on diversity performance. My second bill is the Expanding Opportunity for Minority Depository Institutions Act that will codify a program at Treasury that pairs mentor businesses with protege MDIs, giving the smaller lenders access to things like technical assistance and contracting opportunities. I'm so pleased in my 3rd Congressional District of Ohio, a new MDI has been approved. I would also like to note that my bill, the Ensuring Diverse Leadership Act, has been made in order as an amendment and will be considered later. That amendment will require the feds to consider candidates of diverse ethnicity and gender when filling vacancies in the reserves. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman seeks unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend his remarks, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
As I said, and still I rise, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today to say that those who tolerate hate perpetuate hate. It is not enough, Mr. Speaker, for us to prosecute the purveyors of the hate, those who pull the trigger, those white supremacists. It's not enough to prosecute them individually. We have to prosecute hate itself. If we fail to do so, we fail our country. This is a country that allows us the freedom to move about, to go into stores and to other places of business. Business itself is going to suffer if we don't stop this. And I beg the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, come out of the shadows. Where is the business community? Denounce this white supremacy. Where's the clergy? Denounce this white supremacy. And join me in a moment of silent prayer for all of those who have suffered. I yield back the balance of my time.
Is that too bright for you, sir?
That's okay.
Okay. And we're squared away. We're good.
Okay. Permit me to thank the press in the room, as well as the many members of the press who may be watching from home or from their offices. People are working from home. And I would also thank the many persons who are viewing this as we live stream it. The essence of this message today is that the Texas Republican Party has lost its way. The Texas Republican Party desires to go back to a future that doesn't exist. The Texas Republican Party wants to live in the past, in a past where voting rights for minorities were trampled upon. This would take us back to before the Voting Rights Act became law in 1965. They'd like to go back to a past where transgender people had no rights.
Thank you.
This would clearly take us back before June 30th of 2016, when trans persons couldn't serve in the military. They'd like to go back to a past where guns determine the outcome of disputes. This could take us back to July 11, 1804, when Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. People literally resolved their disputes by shooting it out. They'd like to take us back to a past where there was no United Nations. This would be before the founding of the United Nations in October of 1945. The Texas Republican Party has clearly lost its way because it wants to secede from the Union. This would take us back to before Texas became a part of the Union in December of 1845. Friends, the Texas Republican Party cannot take us back to a past that doesn't exist, obviously, but also a past that had horrific consequences for people. For example, the desire to ban abortion. This would take us back to before Roe versus Wade, January 22nd of 1973. People of goodwill have to take a stand. And I'm here today to say that people of goodwill must take a stand. I'm also here today to say that we're going to have a town meeting this weekend. A town meeting, and we're going to have persons there who will address each of these policy positions that the Texas Republican Party wants to reverse. And we're going to explain to people why it's so important to have these policy positions as they are, as opposed to allowing the Republican Party in the state of Texas to roll back the clock, to turn back the hands of time. We won't accept it. We have to understand it, however, and to understand it, we need to have this town meeting this weekend coming up, this Saturday, so that we can explain it to people. I will give you more information about the town meeting as we progress. But today I want to suggest that everybody's got to get involved in this. I hope that you can see that the Republican Party appears to be, on these policy positions that I have to deal with in Congress, it appears to be moving backwards. It appears to want to take this great nation back to a past that many people thought we'd never see again. We thought that we fought the fight for civil rights and the right to vote. We thought we fought the fight to have a woman have her own choice about things that are related to her body. We thought we fought the fight that would deal with trans persons being recognized and identified and respected. We thought that Texas was a part of the Union. I surely thought that fight was over. And the notion that we should resolve our disputes with guns, that's what you're saying when you have no gun safety laws. Gun safety laws save lives. If you're not going to have any gun safety laws and everybody's going to have a gun and it takes a good guy with a gun to stop a bad guy with a gun, you're literally saying we're going to solve many of our disputes with guns. And that's what you see happening now. Many of these young people and people in general are resolving their disputes with guns. We saw it just recently in Washington, D.C. And the Texas Republican Party is encouraging this. Their behavior as it relates to gun safety sends a message to people that it's okay to use your gun to resolve your concerns in life, which is a sad state of affairs, not only for us here in the state of Texas, but for people across the globe. I don't want to live in a society where the biggest gun rules or where the person with the quickest draw wins. We've gone through that. This is not the wild, wild west, or it shouldn't be, but it looks like it may be. So we have to examine these policy positions, explain to people where we are, so they can better understand that they have to take a stand. And finally, on the question of taking a stand, I have to ask the question, where is the organized business community
the organized business community. I'm not talking about mom and pops. I'm not talking about small businesses. I'm talking about the captains of industry, the people who shape the country, the people who take pride in saying this is my country and that we have the best society in the world. But where is this organized business community? Walmart store, persons murdered. Tops grocery store, persons murdered. That ought to mean something to the organized business community. You've got to get involved. You've got to take a stand. Why? Because many of the people who are dealing with these policy positions in Congress and in state houses around the country, many of the people who deal with these things, they respect you. They listen to you for various and sundry reasons. They listen to you. You've been their supporters. They listen to you. And it's time for you to send them a message that you won't tolerate having guns of war, weapons of war in the hands of 18-year-olds. That's a message that the business community can send, the organized business community, the captains of industry. This kind of messaging has to come from the business community as well. We've reached a point now where nobody can be on the sidelines. Everybody's got to get involved because our country, our democracy, our way of life is at risk. I'm not exaggerating. If you can't see it, come to the event this weekend. Hear other people explain, as I will explain as well, about these policy positions, where we'll say a lot more about each of them. Friends, I beg that you please know that I love my country. I'm proud to be in my country, but I also want to make my country a better place. And to do that, I absolutely have to ask that we all get involved, we all take a position, and I ask the question, where is the organized business community? I respectfully now will address questions that you might have.
Congressman, what kind of message is it sending when you see elected officials doing commercials with, assault rifles, guns, and guys dressed in combat suits for their campaign? In the time that we're in right now, what kind of message is it sending?
I've seen this ad, portions of it, that has a person running for a very high office, armed with what appears to be a long gun, indicating that rhinos is the term that's being used, that is open season on rhinos. Friends, people who, in your opinion, are Republicans in name only, have a right to be Republicans in name only, if that's the absolute fact. They've got a right to. You have no right to send messages indicating that these persons can be harmed, that these persons can suffer as a result of your deciding that you can hunt them down? Are we now in a society where we're going to resolve issues related to elections with long guns, where you hunt people down, open season on people that you differ with? This is not the America that we have fought for, that people have died for. We resolve our disputes with the ballot, not the bullet. And that's where these kinds of commercials are taking us. Back to Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. That was a political dispute, resolved with one of them dying in a duel. These persons who send these messages with these guns and political ads are simply indicating that people can resolve their disputes with the bullet as opposed to the ballot. And that has to stop. We must find a way to stop that type of advertising. Free speech has its limits. Threatening to kill people or sending messages that people can be killed is not acceptable. There are limits. That crosses the line. And we've got to do things to save lives and prevent these kinds of messages from continuing.
And Congressman, I noticed that when you were speaking that you said that we were revisiting a lot of events that we've already visited or covered. Why do you think history is repeating itself, or why do you think we're going down that same road again?
There seems to be a desire in this country to have persons who have, for whatever reasons, believed that they occupied a certain status by virtue of who they were. They want to go back to that status. They want to be the persons who are, for want of better terminology, in a superior position. They want to be in a superior position. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was acquired by virtue of people suffering on Bloody Sunday at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which gave President Lyndon Johnson, a great president from Texas, the opportunity to put it into law, leveled the playing field as it related to voting. It truly tried to bring in an era of one person, one vote, and succeeded to a great extent. Since the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we have more minorities in Congress than we've had. We've had more women to get to Congress, more persons who are of different persuasions to get to Congress. The Voting Rights Act has diversified Congress. And these folk, for whatever reasons, see that as a threat to their status, it seems. But it's not a threat to your status. It's a compliment to the country that we are an inclusive society where everybody can succeed on their merits or fail on their demerits. This is not a society where, by virtue of how you look, you should have special opportunities and privileges. That's not the America that we believe in and that we preached about. Now that we're getting there and everybody's having equal opportunities to succeed, it seems that there are some people who want an advantage. So if there is no Voting Rights Act, we go back to people of color, black people, brown people, people of color, Asian people. They can be discriminated against with impunity because there won't be the Voting Rights Act to provide the protection that we've had and enjoyed that caused us to integrate this society. It's a great part of the integration of this society. Some people want a superior position. And I regret that there are people in this country now who believe that republicanism is being associated too closely with racism. The Republican Party is not a racist party. Republicanism shouldn't be equated to racism, but the actions are given the perception that it is. And that's very unfortunate for the Republican Party. So many of the people who hold these lofty positions, who associate with the Republican Party, it's time for you to get involved with your party because these policy positions that they're adopting are detrimental to the well-being and health of this country. I will close with these comments, friends. I have lived long enough now to understand that Dr. King was right. The truest measure of a person is not where you stand in times of comfort and convenience, but where do you stand in times of challenge and controversy. The truest measure for these captains of industry, members of the organized business community, the truest measure for you is where will you stand? Will you sit on the sidelines? Dr. King also reminded us that on some issues, at some point, silence becomes betrayal. Silence becomes betrayal. Speak up, speak out, take a stand. The truest measure of the person, not just the man, but the person, is where will you stand in these times of challenge and controversy. Thank you very much.